Welcome aboard the history train, destination the American South, right toward the end of the U.S. Civil War. All aboard! Whoop whoop! This is your conductor, Professor Tatum, here to lead us through this lecture. All right, guys, in this lecture, we will be looking at Reconstruction in the American South. Reconstruction, remember, being this period immediately after the Civil War. We'll see what all it entails. We're going to kind of break it into two separate parts. And in this first part here, we'll be looking at various plans and efforts there were to address some treason and secession, which were key components of the American Civil War. We'll be looking at a little context as usual. Then we'll look at President Abraham Lincoln's plans for the Southerners and Southern states who had left the Union. And then we'll look at his successor, President Andrew Johnson's plans for Southerners and Southern states. And then we'll look at Congress's plans throughout Reconstruction for Southerners and Southern states. And then we'll look at how Reconstruction came to a close through a period known as redemption, process and a period, I could say, known as redemption, which was all made possible by a corrupt compromise that'll mark the end of Reconstruction. In order to understand Reconstruction, though, we really first need to understand at least the basics of the U.S. Civil War. Okay, so what was the Civil War? It was a conflict between the United States and 11 Southern states who had left the Union. Those 11 Southern states broke their allegiance to the United States and formed a quasi nation known as the Confederate States of America, commonly referred to as the Confederacy. You'll see me throughout this lecture and the next lecture use this phrase here, CSA. What I'm referring to there is simply the Confederacy, Confederate States of America. But we need to understand causes also of the Civil War. This is something that can be hotly debated even in the 21st century, though evidence is quite clear here. So there are several factors and explanations that played into the South's decision to leave the Union, which in turn led to the Civil War. You'll constantly hear me say there's not a single cause and effect, and not a this and that, not an A and B. There's not just good guys and bad guys. History is so much more than black and white. It is very complex, and I always aim to embrace that complexity. All that said, all of the reasonable explanations that I've read, seen, heard, offered for the cause of the Civil War do point back to a single core issue, and that issue is slavery. Okay, so slavery does seem to be the central cause of the Civil War. The only other real explanation that seems to hold a lot of weight and merit is that it was a war of states' rights. That's an argument commonly made by people, usually to try to undermine the impact of slavery on the Civil War. But we need to consider what rights were states concerned with here. Okay, they were upset that the federal government was placing limits on where slavery could and could not exist. All right, so the states' rights that the states were concerned with was their rights to allow people to hold other human beings in bondage. And this isn't just me making my opinion, saying shit here. There's evidence to back this up, okay? We can certainly see when all the southern states left the Union, they essentially wrote breakup letters to the United States, basically justifications for why they were leaving the United States. And in all of those, it's pretty clear that their key concern is fears of losing their rights to have slavery in their states, or that the federal government has already began placing some restrictions in some areas of where slavery cannot exist. We also need to consider the costs of the Civil War. It was a very costly war in very many ways. It was very economically costly. A lot of federal spending went into this war, and there's been an increase of federal spending ever since the Civil War, tremendously in terms of military spending, but it was also very costly in terms of human lives. Okay, this was the nation's bloodiest war. So we can see here this chart shows American casualties in some prominent wars that the United States has been engaged in, such as the Korean War, the Vietnam War, War of 1812, Mexican War, American Revolution, World War II, and the Civil War here clearly outnumbers all of those. Even if we add together all these different conflicts here and the casualties of those conflicts here, we'll see that's not even going to come close to the losses that the U.S. faced in the Civil War. So there were about 2.9 million Americans who joined the conflict on either side, whether it was for the Confederacy or for the Union, and about a third of those were recorded as casualties by the end of the war, meaning they were either killed, wounded, or missing by the end of the war. There were about 750,000 Americans. This number, by the way, is hotly debated, but somewhere around 750,000 Americans killed in this conflict. Okay, this number could be possibly far higher. All right, there are much higher estimates out there. We need to consider in a lot of these cases when Americans are meeting each other on the battlefield. Imagine you're a member of the Union Army marching through the South, and you guys come across your enemy, and y'all are headed to point A, and they're headed to point B, and you happen to intercept each other. Your biggest concern there is going to be fighting them as quickly as you can and getting the hell out of there because you weren't prepared for battle. And you're not going to sit there trying to get as detailed a record as possible. You're just trying to survive. So it's quite possible that as a result of several of those skirmishes that were kind of unplanned and not very well recorded, that there may be far more losses than we even realize. The Civil War was also, we need to understand, very traumatic for everyone involved. Okay, and this trauma is going to impact the entire nation, really, in one way or another. For those involved, not only are they facing those tremendous losses we just saw, but this was the nation's highest record of limb loss in any conflict up until more recent times, when we've had things like very advanced explosives in the Middle East. This was the highest number of limb loss that people would see, and you can only imagine seeing piles like this outside of tents, or having to lose a limb for oneself, or having a friend or a family member lose their limbs or lose their lives in this very tragic way, and having families pitted apart between different parts of the country. All of this is going to have a very traumatic impact on the individuals involved. We got to keep in mind, mothers, brothers, fathers, sisters, girlfriends, whoever may be back at home. They don't have any kind of text messaging, email, any way of keeping in touch with their family members here. They can be gone for months at a time, and they have no clue if they're alive or dead, if they're going to come back with or without all their limbs. Very, very traumatic experience. Okay. The South, we need to understand, also was in shambles by the end of the Civil War, largely as a result of a campaign led by Union General William Tecumseh Sherman, who marched through parts of the South, carrying out a campaign of total war, destroying infrastructure, burning farms, really trying to just break down the South to pressure them to surrender. All right. And this is all going to feed into this moment of Reconstruction. Okay, this is where we're kind of starting out. This very destructive war that's been very traumatic. There's all kinds of damage to the South. So a big part of this is quite literally reconstructing the South. But we also need to keep in mind how we're going to reconstruct ourselves as a nation and heal from these great wounds that have plagued the nation as a result of the Civil War. And there's going to be, as you might imagine, extensive anger and resentment between Americans in North and South. All right. People in the North are going to blame people in the South for things like this. People in the South are going to blame people in the North for things like this. And these are some of the key issues we're going to see people having to grapple with as we go through this process of Reconstruction after the Civil War. So there's some key issues and concerns we need to understand that were driving this process of Reconstruction. Okay. One was what to do with enslaved people. Right. As we suggested, a key component of the Civil War was slavery. And by the end of the Civil War, as we'll see, some enslaved people were already being freed. So the question stood, should they all be freed? Or should maybe certain numbers of enslaved people be freed? Should it be a gradual process? Should it be instant? All right. And then from there, once enslaved people are freed, should they be granted citizenship? Do they have equal standing to other Americans? And I know us here in the 21st century, through our own biased perspective, like to think, yeah, no shit, of course you do that. That's the humane, decent thing to do. You give them citizenship, you give them equal rights. But we need to understand that this is a very revolutionary idea, okay? And really, in no point in human history has such a large number of people been enslaved and so quickly become citizens with equal rights as we see here in the American Civil War. All right, so that is actually a very radical idea for the time. But we'll look at these issues here a little more in the next lecture, dealing with enslaved people and freed people. What we're going to focus primarily here in this lecture on is how to handle the former Confederates. Okay, so the people who took up arms against the United States. Should they face punishment or reconciliation? And there were loud voices advocating on either side. All right, and a lot of how we remember and understand the Civil War kind of undermines the fact that taking up arms against the U.S. Army was treason. Okay, this was no joke. These people were killing American soldiers. they were threatening the United States. This is treason. And throughout history, even into more recent times, mass treason like this is normally handled with mass executions, okay? People being hanged in masse, or being beheaded, or being lined up before firing squads, right? So there's a lot of people saying that this is what should happen to those Southerners who had left the Union and who had fought against the United States. But there's also the issue of what to do with the states themselves, okay? These states that had left the Union and formed the Confederacy. How will they be readmitted to the Union? Are they going to be brought straight back in under lenient conditions as states with the same rights as all the other states like they had before? Or will they be treated more like conquered military territories, placed under harsh conditions, placed under military rule? Because they have left the United States, they've led this treason, perhaps they should be treated in a more kind of conquered territory type of way. Another key question we'll be looking at is who will lead the Reconstruction of the South? And this will be very contentious, all right? Presidents will want to take control, as will Congress. They're going to kind of vie back and forth over who can make what kinds of decisions about what Reconstruction will look like. And then the former Confederates themselves will also try to play a pretty heavy role in reconstructing the South. And some people go along with that, saying, well, who better understands the South than Southerners? Perhaps they are the best leaders of reconstructing their own states into the nation. So there's going to be a lot of contention here between these different groups. So all this may be a little confusing. And this is something we definitely need to have a general grasp on moving forward when we're talking about presidents, talking about Congress, their different roles. So I just want to make sure we have a general understanding of the structure of U.S. government before we move any further. Okay. So when we're looking at U.S. government, we have three equal branches of government. This is a separation of powers here. We have these three branches to keep any one part of the federal government from getting too much power and becoming tyrannical. Ideally, these different branches of government should be keeping an eye on one another through a system of checks and balances. So let's look at them one by one. The legislative branch, also known as Congress, writes laws. We have a bicameral legislature created by the U.S. Constitution, meaning there's two houses of our Congress, being the House of Representatives and the Senate. Okay. Then we have the executive branch. This is the branch that enforces the laws. This is the branch most people are familiar with. These are kind of the face of U.S. politics of the 21st century. So that was not always the case. This is the president, vice president, and the president's cabinet. But then we also have the judicial branch, which interprets the laws and is comprised of the Supreme Court and lower courts. All right. So when we're talking about Congress's plans for Reconstruction versus the president's plans for Reconstructions, what we're really talking about here is, in a sense, contest for power between the legislative and executive branches of government. Kind of a bigger picture, Unit 1 question. How will the United States become a modern nation? Okay, here in particular, we're asking how the reconstruction of the American South will be a part of the new America that is emerging after the Civil War. A lot of historians, based on records we see from people at the time, have come to recognize and understand the Civil War as a sort of second American Revolution, and therefore understanding that after the Civil War, the United States is going to look far different than it had before the Civil War. There's essentially going to be a new America being constructed after the Civil War. People both in North and South have used this kind of rhetoric in their primary sources about the Civil War as a sort of second American Revolution, okay? And we'll see that it was in many ways a very revolutionary moment in time. Revolution meaning, of course, complete change from one to the other. So as we look through this entire lecture on Reconstruction, I want us to understand that the South being constructed here is being constructed alongside a bigger reconstruction that's occurring throughout the nation as it's becoming a more modern nation after the Civil War. And the question that really is going to drive this particular lecture, though, is how harsh were the conditions placed on former Confederates and Confederate states in order for them to be readmitted to the United States? We got to keep in mind with this traditional ways that mass treason has been handled. Remember, people who commit treason normally face mass execution. Considering that, let's look and see how the South was readmitted into the Union, what the kind of process looked like, what terms they were held to, and see how harsh it really was for them. So we're going to look at a few different plans for Reconstruction here, starting with President Abraham Lincoln, who was president throughout the Civil War. Lincoln didn't even recognize the Confederacy as a sovereign nation. Right? He saw them as states in a sort of rebellion against the United States. And he wanted to quash that rebellion in order to restore order in the Union. Right? He wanted to preserve the Union. And he set pretty lenient conditions considering his rhetoric and understanding of the Civil War here. With his goal being to preserve the Union, he wasn't interested in placing a whole lot of harsh conditions on the South. Okay, so Lincoln's plan for readmitting the Southern states was what we call the 10% plan. So this was a plan in which he required 10% of voters in Confederate states to agree to give up secession, to repudiate the secession, and to swear their allegiance to the United States moving forward. All right. It is worth noting as well, when we say voters here, eligible voters in this period would only be white males. Okay. So that those voters, if 10% of them could agree to say, you know what, we are no longer loyal to the Confederacy, that was a mistake. Our allegiance moving forward will always be to the United States. We will be good, loyal Americans moving forward. As long as they could say that, 10%, that state was welcomed back into the Union. Very, very lenient conditions. But this was countered by some individuals in Congress. Okay, Congress made a counter plan known as the Wade-Davis Bill. So the Wade-Davis Bill, again, we need to understand, is Congress's counter plan to the 10% plan. It was proposed by a couple of radical Republicans. Remember, those were the guys who were wanting such radical things like an end to slavery and basic civil rights and citizenship for African Americans. So radical, I know. But this was led by radical Republicans. Benjamin Wade, who was a senator, and Henry Davis, who was a congressman in the House of Representatives. They suggested that a majority of voters in every southern state needed to not only agree to repudiate secession, but also needed to take what was called the Ironclad Oath. The Ironclad Oath was an oath in which a person swore that they had never served the Confederacy in any form. Okay. So essentially, what this would mean is that anybody who had served the Confederacy, whether it was in the military or in the Confederate government, would not be eligible for the kind of readmission status here without going through some kind of extra process. Okay. Lincoln did not like this bill clearly. Okay. In order for a bill to pass into a law, the president must sign it. Okay, that goes back into those checks and balances we were talking about. All right, so these guys here in the legislative branch have made this bill. They want it to become a law, but in order for it to become a law, the executive branch under the president must sign that bill into law. And when Lincoln received this bill, he responded with what we call a pocket veto, meaning he read over it, said, "I don't like this malarkey." He folded it up, stuffed it into his pocket, and never looked at it again. All right, that's a bit metaphorical, of course. He probably didn't literally fold it up and put it in his pocket, but he basically just kind of ignored the bill and didn't do anything so that it would not pass. All right, he didn't really say anything one way or another so that it couldn't be held against him what stance he took, yet it also would not pass into law. So really, we saw that nothing became of this. Lincoln's 10% plan and Congress's plan neither really passed. But Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction, before they could go any further than this, were cut short, okay, because he was assassinated less than a week after the end of the Civil War by an assassin named John Wilkes Booth. I'm not going to get all into the assassination here, though it is very fascinating. There are some great books on this. If you're interested, let me know. I can certainly give you a great recommendation here. All kinds of videos on YouTube as well. But essentially, he was shot by a Southern sympathizer who was hoping that the mayhem of this assassination would create enough chaos in which the South could regain traction and come back together. This was all part of a bigger conspiracy that Booth had cooked up. He was hoping to have one guy also go kill the vice president, Andrew Johnson. There was another guy who was sent to kill the Secretary of State. But the guy who was sent to kill the Secretary of State did find him in his sick bed, and he knifed him up a bit, but he wasn't able to kill him. The Secretary of State ended up surviving the attack. And the guy who was going to go kill Andrew Johnson ended up getting cold feet. He hung out at the bar for a while, had one drink, then another, then another. And as he was getting drunker and drunker, he said, "You know what? This is a pretty stupid plan. I'm not going through with this." And so as a result, I do want to take a quick minute here on this word significance. Okay, anytime we're talking about significance in this class, historical significance, I'm always looking for one of a few things. Okay, it's either going to be the first of something, the last of something, led to something else, was an example of, or demonstrated something else. Okay, write that down. It's going to always be one of those five things I'm looking for. First to something, last to something, led to something else, example of something else, or demonstrated something else. Okay. All that I'm looking for, one of those things. And it should always be pretty obvious. You shouldn't have to think real hard about it. And you certainly should not have to ask ChatGPT or Google what the answer is. All right. That's going to require a little critical thinking. But for the most part, I'll be giving you the answer if you're paying attention. In this case, we can see that Lincoln's assassination, though, led to President Andrew Johnson, led to significant, becoming the new president. All right, and he had a much different plan for Reconstruction than Lincoln did. We need to consider a bit about Johnson in terms of his personal and political background to really understand his Reconstruction policies. So he was a Southern Democrat, and he ran alongside President Lincoln, who was the face of the Northern Republican Party. And this was all during the Civil War. And the South, led by the Democratic Party, had many states who had left the Union. And then there were a few border states who were mostly Democratic states who were kind of looking to both sides to see what was going to happen here. Why would we have in that moment a Southern Democrat run on the presidential ticket along with a Northern Republican? Well, their goal there was to show the nation that this Civil War was not an inevitable conflict, okay? That you could have a Northern Republican working alongside a Southern Democrat, and we can work together as a union. But that kind of led to some problems when Lincoln was assassinated, and now we have the Southern Democrat taking control of Reconstruction. But a couple other things about Johnson. He grew up very poor. He had to kind of work his way up the social and economic ladders of the American South. And he was always kind of treated like dirt by the old school, old money, traditional elite. All the old planters and slaveholders who owned the big plantations, they looked at him as kind of poor white trash. And they gave him a real hard time as he was trying to work his way up the social and economic ladder. So he had this long standing resentment against the traditional wealthy elite, who were primarily the leaders of the slaveholding class who were running the Confederacy. All right. All these things, the fact that he was a Southerner who grew up poor and worked hard, and the fact that he had a resentment toward the kind of old money in the South would impact his Reconstruction policies. Johnson's plans were mostly lenient because he could relate to most common Southerners, right? He didn't want to be too harsh on them. He didn't want to punish them. He understood where they were coming from. So what he did is he granted amnesty, meaning legal pardons, to the majority of Southerners who were willing to pledge their loyalty to the United States moving forward. All right, he said, as long as you're willing to rejoin and be a good, loyal American moving forward, you got my blessing. Come into the nation. But there were a few exceptions to his amnesty. There were some individuals who would have to come to him and either write to him or come to him in person to directly request a pardon from him. So, one group of individuals who had to request pardons were Confederate officials. Another group were Confederate officers who had served in the military. That kind of makes sense, right? These are the leaders of the rebellion here. They have to have an extra condition held to them in order to rejoin the Union. But another group of people who had to ask for a pardon in order to be able to rejoin the Union were the wealthiest members of Confederate society. Now, why is it that he would hold the wealthiest individuals in the South to this same standard that he's holding other Confederate leaders to? Well, that has to do again with his long-standing resentment toward that old money who gave him a hard time when he was younger. All right. As one student put it very eloquently when I asked this question, he was being fucking petty. Okay, so that's Johnson's plans for the Confederates themselves, the Southerners who had taken up rebellion or lived in the states that took up rebellion against the United States. But what were his plans for the actual states themselves? Again, he had some pretty lenient requirements. One thing he required was that all the states needed to ratify the 13th Amendment. You should have read that by now. Of course, that's the amendment that bans slavery. Johnson didn't care so much about slavery one way or the other. He did have a strong resentment against large-scale slaveholders, but he had no issues with slavery itself. This is kind of something that he just realized politically he wasn't going to be able to beat Congress on. So he said, yes, that's one thing. You have to ratify the 13th Amendment. He also required them to repudiate Confederate debts, meaning considering any debts that they had acquired throughout their time as a Confederacy to be null and void. The goal here was to kind of break away from recognizing the Confederacy as a sovereign nation. All right. If you acquired the debt under this nation, that's saying that as a nation. By saying we no longer recognize that debt, you're in a way saying we don't recognize the sovereignty of this nation. Okay. And then he also required these different states here who had left the Union to write new state constitutions. Okay. Basically saying, well, the state constitutions that you had written that led you into rebellion, we kind of need some update in there. All right. But overall, these are very lenient conditions. Again, remembering that the traditional way treason like this had been handled is for people to be executed and for states and the territories in rebellion to be placed in many cases under strict military rule. This is very lenient conditions being placed on the South by President Johnson here. And how did the Southerners respond to this leniency? How did the former Confederate states, that is, respond to this leniency? They treated it like a free for all right? They took advantage. They started pushing their luck and abusing their power. Do not do this. This is extremely poor character. Just because there's not somebody there breathing down your neck telling you should be doing something or shouldn't be doing something doesn't mean you shouldn't make the decision to do the right thing, all right? You should do the right thing because it's the right fucking thing to do, all right? Just because your professor's not there watching you behind your screen saying, do not use ChatGPT. Nope, actually go look at the video and look at the lecture and use your head a little bit. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do those things, okay? Do the right thing because it's the right thing. Choosing to be lazy and take a free for all and take advantage of somebody's leniency or somebody not being there breathing down your neck will eventually bite you in the ass, as we'll see it does for these Confederates here. But how are they taking advantage? We see that former Confederate leaders were playing key roles, for example, in writing these new state constitutions that Johnson was requiring them to write. They were leading in many cases, the constitutional conventions that were writing these constitutions. There were also several military and government officers from the Confederacy who are now coming into government positions at the state and local level in these former Confederate states. A clear example we can see of all this is Alexander Stephens. Okay, Alexander Stephens had been the vice president of the Confederacy. All right. And after the Civil War, when the state of Georgia was trying to rejoin the Union, they elected him as their senator. Okay, so this is the leader of the rebellion against the United States, now trying to become a representative of that state's government, saying, we're willing to rejoin you, we'll play by the rules. Sure, we're putting the leaders of the rebellion back into power, but we'll just ignore that part. And Johnson just kind of turned a blind eye to all of this. Okay, he knew the southern states were taking advantage of his leniency, and he just kind of let it be. Again, we'll see this getting way more out of hand when we look at the aspect of slavery and people being freed from bondage and the rights being granted and denied to formerly enslaved people. Going to be all over the place there when he turns a blind eye. All right, so as President Johnson was turning a blind eye to what the Southerners were doing and allowing the former Confederates to basically reclaim control of the South, or at least try to, Congress was getting pretty upset, and they started giving President Johnson some pushback. All right, they started formulating their own plan for Reconstruction. Remember, one of the key questions driving Reconstruction is who should take the reins, essentially, of Reconstruction. Should it be the president, or should it be Congress, or the former Confederates themselves? Well, Congress certainly thinks that they should have the lead here. So Congress's plans for former Confederates were pretty much a direct response to Johnson's kind of negligence, which allowed former Confederates to begin staking a small claim of power once again. So, for example, as these former Confederate leaders were being elected as senators and congressmen, when they came to be seated at Congress, the rest of the Congress refused to seat them. To further emphasize their unwillingness to allow former Confederate leaders to have any kind of power, Congress used the ironclad oath as a condition for anybody in the former Confederate states to be able to vote or hold public office. Remember that ironclad oath was an oath in which a person had to swear that they had never served the Confederacy, all right? Therefore, we can see the historical significance of this ironclad oath is that it led to, underline, write that down, do what you got to do, led to former Confederate leaders being unable to vote and unable to hold political office, all right? Congress reinforced these restrictions that they were placing on former Confederate leaders with a section that they included in the 14th Amendment. I would say that this is perhaps the most radical, the most transformative amendment in the U.S. Constitution, other than the First Amendment, which grants us the basics like the right to free speech, free assembly, freedom of religion, etc. Aside from that amendment, this 14th Amendment is the most boom, mind boggling, kind of defines what it means to be an American. And unfortunately, in the 21st century, we are really letting a lot of the meaning of the 14th Amendment become very ambiguous and kind of go by the wayside. But in addition to doing things like granting citizenship for all people born or naturalized in the United States, regardless of race, one thing included here in the 14th Amendment in Section 3 was that no individuals who have participated in a rebellion or insurrection are able to vote or hold public office. All right. In this historical context in which this was passed, this was a direct response to the former Confederates saying you are unable to vote or hold public office because you participated in a rebellion against the United States. Again, this is certainly part of this amendment that we have very unfortunately let go to the wayside in the 21st century. All right, so that's Congress's plans for former Confederates themselves, the individuals who participated in the rebellion. But we also need to look at their plans for readmitting the former Confederate states back into the Union. This was largely defined by a series of acts passed by Congress called the Reconstruction Acts. So these acts required all former Confederate states to write new state constitutions. Again, and I say again, because remember, President Johnson had already required all of the former Confederate states to write new state constitutions. But Congress said, hey, we know what you did with those state constitutions. You had former Confederate leaders coming into your constitutional conventions, and they're the ones who essentially wrote these state constitutions. So these are no good. You got to start fresh and write yet again new state constitutions. They also required all these former Confederate states, as the terms to be readmitted to the Union, to ratify the 13th and 14th Amendments. 14th Amendment, I just got into a little bit. 13th, again, you should have read by now. But very generally, that's the amendments that ban slavery throughout the nation, with a major loophole, which we'll be looking a bit more into in the next lecture and moving forward. But one major thing that these Reconstruction Acts did is temporarily converted the former Confederate states into a series of 5 separate military districts. All right. And there are reasons for this. This wasn't just the oppressive Yankee government trying to keep the South down. No, they had very specific goals for being here in these former Confederate states. All right. One thing they were doing is they were trying to ensure that former Confederate leaders were not infiltrating these state constitutional conventions as the new state constitutions were being written. But they were also providing protections for African Americans and freed people as they began gaining things like citizenship from the 14th Amendment and later protected right to vote under the 15th Amendment. Okay. You need to understand that throughout Reconstruction, especially in these former Confederate states, there was extensive political and racial violence. Okay. There was mob violence, there were lynchings, there were race riots, and the military was there trying to help keep some form of order as the South was kind of in this ambiguous state writing their new state constitutions. Okay. In these Reconstruction Acts, overall, we got to consider here the impact they're going to have on the Southerners living in these states. Okay. So, from these former Confederates' perspectives, they have now been disenfranchised. Okay. They've been kicked out of political office, told you cannot vote, and they're now seeing people who they had enslaved and subordinated within their social, economic, and political hierarchies now being granted citizenship, being granted the right to vote. And as we'll see in the next lecture, even being brought into some cases into political office. So this, as a result, is going to lead to a long-term resentment from people in the South against the federal government. Okay, so to sum it up a bit more, it's going to lead to resentment toward powerful, active federal government by a lot of Southerners, okay? And this will expand beyond the Confederacy, and some of these people in these other states as well will take on this resentment toward this idea of an active government, and that'll become a key principle of the Southern Democratic Party. As we'll see moving forward, the Democratic Party is the party that will dominate the South for nearly 100 years after Reconstruction. But as Congress was implementing these very radical Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, as well as all kinds of civil rights legislation, making some kinds of economic changes in the South, bringing schools to the South, and putting a bunch of funding into the South, they were meeting a lot of pushback from President Johnson. Okay, remember, Johnson's plan was to kind of just set some simple conditions for the Southerners and then really just let them do whatever they want. So he didn't like the idea of Congress being so active and placing these restrictions and being so heavily involved in granting rights to, say, freed people. So pretty frequently, as Congress was trying to pass laws, they would be vetoed by President Johnson, meaning he would try to stop them from passing. Now, in most cases, Congress had enough support that they were able to override his vetoes and get their laws passed anyways, but that was just slowing down the process. And after a while, they got kind of tired of Johnson being this thorn in their side who they had to continuously deal with and continuously figure out how to get past. So they said, you know what? Why don't we just get him out of office? So Congress came up with a plan to basically set up Johnson to be impeached. All right. So impeachment, we need to understand, involves two steps. The House of Representatives will first bring charges before the president saying that he has committed treason in some way. Then the Senate will hold a trial to determine, number one, whether there's enough evidence to confirm that, yes, the president has committed the treason that the House has accused him of. And number two, whether the crime he has committed is serious enough to remove him from office. All right. So basically, the House brings charges before the president, then the Senate holds a trial and decides whether or not they're going to remove the president from office. What Congress did here is a bit shady. I'm not going to lie. Not saying Johnson wasn't an asshole and he didn't deserve it, but Congress was kind of pushing their power a little bit here. They passed a law called the Tenure of Office Act. This law essentially said that the president, Johnson, of course, in this case, could not fire any federal official without congressional approval. Right? So if he wanted to remove anyone from office, he had to get Congress's permission. And they knew Johnson, they knew he was a hothead, and they knew that there were a lot of people in his cabinet who he didn't like. So they knew eventually he would probably challenge this law, giving them grounds to impeach him. Sure enough, his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who was a member of the Republican Party, Johnson decided he didn't like having him around, and he tried to fire him without getting approval from Congress. Boom, he had now violated the law. Congress used this as grounds to impeach President Johnson, all right? This was the first presidential impeachment in U.S. history. Now, when this went to the Senate to go to trial to determine whether or not Johnson should be removed from office, it was very clear that this was all well orchestrated by the radical Republicans, okay? By Johnson's opponents, that is, in Congress. They voted one vote short of what was required to remove him from office, all right? This essentially was Congress sending Johnson a message, letting him know, hey, dude, we're cutting you a break here. We're letting you stay in office. But if we want to, we very easily can remove you from office. So stop challenging us and you'll be okay. But if you keep pushing your luck with us, next time we might not fall one vote short and you might find yourself out of a job. And this impeachment led President Johnson to back down, all right? He got the message and he allowed here Congress to take full control of Reconstruction, all right? And from here, Congress would begin implementing all kinds of radical changes, not only throughout the South, but throughout the country. While Congress's efforts toward Reconstruction were heavily supported by certain individuals, mostly by freed people as well as their supporters, the scalawags and carpetbaggers who we looked at before, there were a lot of people who were strongly opposed to the process of Reconstruction. And by the 1870s, there were others who were just losing interest in it, okay? Even people who had once been firmly behind the process of reconstructing the South in the way that Congress and others wanted to see it happen, began saying, let's just find a way to bring this process to a close. There's multiple reasons for that. One, of course, several people who were Southern sympathizers saw Reconstruction as perhaps being a little too strict on the South by keeping former Confederates disenfranchised and out of power. Others, of course, had more racial reasons that they opposed Reconstruction, seeing African Americans gaining rights as the traditional elites of Confederate society were largely being disempowered in many ways. Again, having to use empathy, not sympathy there for many of us, understanding perspectives without necessarily agreeing with them. But other reasons that people were losing interest in Reconstruction is there were other issues going on in this time that people were just far more concerned with. Throughout the same period that Reconstruction was occurring, There was also a big boom in industrialization and a rise of big business. There was a big boom, for example, in railroads, which allowed for more and more people to begin moving out west. And as people began to move out west and settle out west, they began to realize that the West is not just this big unpopulated wilderness as they imagined, but there were several societies of Native Americans already settled out in the West. Okay. And as the federal government began finding different ways to cope with these indigenous peoples, often making sketchy treaties with them, which were frequently violated, there was a lot of conflict between many of these Native American groups and the U.S. And a lot of people began saying, well, perhaps we need to stop concentrating all of our money, all of our effort, and even our military into the South and move them out into the West instead. Okay, so for a variety of reasons, people were beginning to lose interest in Reconstruction by the 1870s. And throughout the process, there were, of course, several people who just stood in opposition to the idea of Reconstruction and what it stood for. And for all these reasons, President Ulysses Grant, who had actually been the commander of the Union Army, all right, and he was a Republican leader, a member of the party of people like Abraham Lincoln and the Radical Republicans, passed an act known as the Amnesty Act of 1872, in which he decided to grant total blanket amnesty for Confederate involvement in the Civil War. Okay, this allowed former Confederates to once again vote and hold office. They didn't need to take any kind of ironclad oath. They were just granted amnesty, and their states were able to rejoin the Union. All right, so this led to the readmission of Confederate states into the Union. So a lot of people saw this as a step of progress. Okay, that sweet, we've resolved the issue of what to do with former Confederates and former Confederate states. Grant's Amnesty Act addresses that issue, right? It says former Confederates, they are forgiven. Former Confederate states, bring them back into the nation. Let's stop messing around. This also led to, however, a process known as redemption. And there were many people within the South who were set on, as they considered it, redeeming the South. Okay. Those who were claiming to want to redeem the South were really interested in making the South as much like it was before the Civil War as possible. And this process was all made possible by Grant's Amnesty Act. So, what really was redemption, though? How can we really understand it, put it into words, and put a label on it? So, Reconstruction, I am suggesting, is a sort of revolution, okay, in the sense that it led to very enormous change. It led to a very transformative moment in U.S. history, in which people who had been disenfranchised, that is, freed people, were not only freed from bondage, but were quickly made citizens and given the right to vote, which is very revolutionary. We'll talk about that a bit more in the next lecture. We also saw individuals who were leaders of the South, those former Confederate leaders and Confederate elites, being held to certain conditions and in many cases being disenfranchised and being barred from political power throughout the South. All right. Very revolutionary, very transformative. Well, redemption is a counter to all of that. All right. Redemption we can see as collective efforts by Southern Democrats, all right, mainly former Confederates and their supporters, reclaiming control of the South. And what we saw throughout this process of redemption was the Democratic Party beginning to reclaim control and having a very strong hold over the South. And when these former Confederates and their supporters came into power, they began undoing a lot of the changes that had been occurring throughout Reconstruction. So, for example, if we look to Texas, in Texas, there had been a governor. I don't care that you know his name for the sake of this, but there was a governor named Edmund J. Davis. All right. Davis was a Union veteran of the Civil War, a supporter of Reconstruction. All right. So when he became governor, he began implementing all kinds of very revolutionary, radical changes here in Texas. All right. He began implementing all kinds of public works projects. He put a lot of funding into public schools. He also helped integrate racially public schools, meaning ending segregation in public schools. He also established a biracial state police force. All right, so a lot of very revolutionary things going on there. But throughout these years of redemption, okay, so once this process of redemption began to occur, Davis was replaced by a former Confederate veteran, a guy named Richard Koch. Again, I don't care you know his name, but Richard Koch, this former Confederate, was replacing a Union veteran and he undid a lot of the changes that Union veteran Davis had implemented throughout his time as governor. Okay, so Richard Koch, for example, shut down that biracial state police force. He resegregated schools. He cut a lot of the funding for a lot of the public works projects. All right, so we can see he's reversing a lot of the changes that Davis had made during his years as governor. Right? And that's one example we see here in Texas. Throughout the South, Democrats began reclaiming control of the South, many of them former Confederates or supporters of the Confederacy, and they began undoing a lot of the changes that Republicans had made throughout the South during Reconstruction. But what really brought Reconstruction to a close was a corrupt compromise between the Democratic and Republican parties known as the Compromise of 1877. What this compromise was settling was the presidential election of 1876. In this election, there was a Republican candidate, Rutherford Hayes, who was a big supporter of Reconstruction. He said, if y'all vote for me, I promise to keep Reconstruction going. And there was also a Democratic candidate named Samuel Tilden. All right. Tilden said, if you vote for me, I promise to end Reconstruction. This was a very contested election. There were some hotly debated electoral results in some of the states. And the reason for this, to be frank, was that both sides cheated pretty bad. All right. There were a lot of dead people voting. There were people casting multiple ballots. It was very clear that some of these votes from both sides were fraudulent. So Congress put together a special committee to try to see who won this election, and they kind of argued back and forth, but it was very unclear who won this election, right? They could not agree on who the winner was. There was a lot of disputes over which votes were legit, which ones were fraudulent, and it was very unclear who won this thing. So that's where we saw this compromise come in. And a very kind of shady bargain behind closed doors, Republicans and Democrats came up with this agreement. The Democrats said, look, we know you want your guy here, Rutherford Hayes, the Republican candidate, to become president. What if we allow that? But in turn, Hayes has to agree to do some things that we want. And they gave the Republicans kind of a list of things they'd like to see them do if they allowed their guy Hayes to take office. And at the top of that list was bringing an end to Reconstruction. So the Republicans kind of weighed out their options here. They said, look, we have two choices here pretty much. We can tell the Democrats to go themselves and not take their offer. In that case, we don't have Hayes as president, and Tilden will probably become president. And when Tilden becomes president, he's going to end Reconstruction. And we don't have a guy in the White House. Our opponents are in the White House, and Reconstruction comes to an end. That's an ultimate failure. But we also have the option to take the deal, right? What if we do agree to let Hayes become president, and he also has to agree to end Reconstruction? Well, in that case, that sucks. We lose out on Reconstruction. We have to bring it to an end, but at least we get to keep our guy in office. Right? The Republicans went ahead and took the deal. Okay. You can see here in this very clever political cartoon, President Hayes is riding into the White House on a donkey, which is the symbol of the Democratic Party, kicking Tilden off to the side. Pretty much, though, what I want us to really understand about this compromise of 1877 is that it led to the end of Reconstruction. All right, so despite all the efforts from various individuals with conflicting plans and policies, right, from President Lincoln and his supporters during the Civil War, to President Johnson, who took office after Lincoln was assassinated, to Congress, especially radical Republicans in Congress, who challenged both Lincoln and Johnson in different ways, all trying to implement different plans and policies related to bringing the South back into the Union and addressing these former Confederates who had taken up arms against the United States. All of their efforts were brought to a kind of swift close with this compromise of 1877. What we're going to look at on our next lecture is a different perspective of Reconstruction. Rather than looking at it through the lens of politicians and their plans and policies, we'll be looking both at how Reconstruction impacted freed people and also the role that freed people played in this process of Reconstruction. Stay tuned. We'll be seeing that next.